So our next panel here today is co-designing justice, engaging data and justice users to improve accessibility, systems, and outcomes. As you can see, we've changed the format a little bit. We have our panelists up front. The moderator I'd like to introduce, a distinguished colleague of mine, Andrew Solomon, is the Senior Rule of Law Advisor at the U.S. Agency for International Development and its Center of Excellence on Democracy, Rights, and Governance. Interagency collaboration is something Andrew's been involved in many different ways at USAID, coordinating with State Department, the INL, DRL bureaus, as well as the Department of Justice, OPDAT, as well as multilateral organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the OECD. Before joining USAID, Andrew served as a Foreign Policy Fellow and Deputy Director of the Brookings Institution Project on Internal Displacement, where he formally supported the mandate of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Internal Displacement. Prior to that, Mr. Solomon worked with us at ABA Rowley, and then the American Society of International Law, and the Office of the High Representative in Bosnia. It's a real pleasure to have Andrew back with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew as our moderator. Andrew, take it away.
Thanks, Scott. I did not expect an introduction like that. I would just say I am not the Senior Rule of Law Advisor. I am a Senior Rule of Law Advisor
I was going by chronological.
at USAID. In fact, I have another Senior Rule of Law Advisor here. We have a good team at USAID, but it is indeed a pleasure to be here for this event with the ABA. This event on what is perhaps the most exciting and the hottest topic in the rule of law community, not just in this town, but I would argue around the world. And I'm talking about people-centered justice. We're all talking about people-centered justice today. That's something. And I'd like to thank the ABA for convening everyone here today in person and also online to better understand and to examine this approach to strengthening justice systems and services and ultimately respect for the rule of law. And as many of you know, and as Betsy Anderson mentioned earlier, USAID recently released our first ever rule of law policy after some decades, several decades, of doing this work around the world, and we are very excited about it. We developed this policy to re-elevate rule of law as part of USAID's development mission, but also to do rule of law promotion better, to do it differently. And a significant impetus for the policy was based on our recognition that our interventions were not as likely or not as successful as we like to think. Our results were not necessarily as sustainable or as durable as we often hope. And as we've heard today, we continue to stare at a significant global justice gap. We have the data, which also relates to a significant trust gap and decline in public trust and the legitimacy of rule of law institutions, which relates to another theme that we heard today was democratic backsliding. So our policy in many ways is geared towards addressing this current terrain and looking forward. Among other things, most notably, and most relevant to this discussion, our policy does embrace the people-centered justice paradigm for USAID's work moving forward, shifting from one that arguably overemphasized institutions and their institutional needs as they understand them. But Judge McEwen, institutions still matter. We are not moving away from institutions, or things like independence, because you can't have a people-centered justice system without an independent judiciary, I would argue. But we're now going to pay more attention to justice systems and services and how they engage the people and the communities that they are mandated to serve. So independence, accountability, efficiency of institutions still matter, but we now want to be transforming the systems, the institutions therein, and the services they provide, reorienting them to the justice seeker, her or his experience and the outcomes they seek. So we are also looking at how to make systems and services more user-friendly, problem-solving, prevention-oriented, and of course, data-driven. So as we shift this paradigm, we are learning as an agency. We're learning from our partners. We're learning from practitioners. We're learning from innovators in this country and around the world. And we're learning from our panelists here today. So I'm very pleased to introduce, moving down the panel, Malia Brink from the SMU School of Law, also ABA's Standing Committee on Legal Aid and Indigent Defense, Judge Lucy Armendariz, pardon me, of the Supreme Court of Los Angeles County, Judge Marcus DeLarge of the New Orleans Criminal District Court, and from ABA Rowley, the Middle East Director, Blerta Pizzari. So first, we are going to dig into the what and the why of people-centered justice, carrying forward the discussion that we started this morning. Then we will look at how to put people-centered justice into practice in courts, in legal aid, and legal services, and in other ways. We will explore the role of data and what data-driven justice entails. And then we hope to have a little bit of time left at the end to engage you, to hear your comments, and to answer your questions. So, everyone ready? Okay. So I'd like to pose to the panel, and it'll be more lightning round, 5 minutes each. You know, we've heard this term, people-centered justice, a lot this morning. So I would just ask each of you to briefly articulate, what does people-centered justice mean to you? And what's the impetus for this approach? Is it new? If it is, what's new about it? Or if it's just the same old thing in a new package, what's that look like? So, Malia.
Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm incredibly pleased to be here. My time at the ABA before I joined SMU, and in fact, for all of my career, I have been focused on public defense reform and public defense services. And you know, public defenders all have clients, and you would think that inherently having a client, being a lawyer, is people-centered, right? Your job is about your client. But when you serve people in need, when you serve, when you're not in control of your own caseloads, you maybe have, oh, I'm very sorry, thank you. When you serve people in need, as public defenders do, when you serve an extraordinary number of clients, that client-centeredness can and often does fade away. And I want to start by saying that, you know, public defense reform has been in crisis since its foundation. Gideon did not, unfortunately, really explain who is entitled to lawyers, right? It just said people who can't afford one, which is not a great definition. It didn't say how jurisdictions or even who should be providing those lawyers, right? It just sort of was this wonderful pronunciation with very little policy guidance. In my efforts to kind of bring that to fruition, I've drafted ABA policy, I've conducted research and pursued policy reforms. And in doing that work, I think people-centered justice is about asking a question, no matter whether you're engaged in direct representation or doing policy work or doing research, whatever you're pursuing, right? What's the goal? Where is the focus, right? Whose perspective are you putting forward? Who's involved in the design and the execution, and who's leading? And I think if we ask those questions about whatever we are doing, we get closer and closer to people-centered justice. And let me give you some examples of how I think that works in some of the work that I've been engaged in recently. In 2002, the ABA passed a very seminal policy in the world of public defense. It was called the 10 Principles of a Public Defense Delivery System, right? Really critical things necessary for providing good public defense. Kind of conditions precedent in good lawyer speak, right? For good public defense. I don't think the original draft mentioned client, right? It talked about training, talked about supervision, talked about funding, didn't necessarily mention clients. And so in the redraft that is coming for 2022, client-centeredness is very much a part of, I think, where the ABA is headed with the 10 principles. That's important. In the realm of research for the ABA, I really worked on two different kinds of pieces. One was misdemeanor court research, which was very observational in nature. You are sitting in courtrooms trying to understand what is going on. Do people have good representation? Are there public defenders? What are those public defenders doing? Client-centered means you go outside of the courtroom and you talk to people and report their experiences and make those experiences front and center in that qualitative research. You have to sort of kick off reminders about perceptions, but I would argue that the next step in client-centeredness in that research is the court watch movement, right? Which is centering not just doing this qualitative research, but putting it in the hands of the community, empowering communities beyond lawyers watching lawyers to observe the courts and talk about what their experience is as a community and what they see in watching these courts. And then I want just briefly on kind of more data-driven research, right? The ABA is, and SCLADE in particular, has engaged in public defender workload studies. Public defender workload studies, are on their face about as far away from people-centered as you might think. It is an effort to quantify the time needed for an attorney to provide good public defense services in particular types of cases. The result is like a case weight. It's a number, right? Very not people-centered. It's a number of hours needed. And the primary purpose is budgeting, right? Trying to get resources for public defense. And you think, that's not people-centered, right? And I think data gets that a lot. Data is not people-centered. It's numbers. It's inherently not people-centered. But what I would say is the reason that you do that work is to ensure that the client receives the time needed, the attorney time needed to actually have good representation. And so it is at its heart all about, so how do you, like, the goal, and the goal is about the client. And the goal of that very data-driven, arguably quantitative, resulting research is really about people, centering people and centering the time that people need for this system to work well. And then I would say that part of people centering is pursuing policy that also centers and engages with, for us, what is client communities, and putting them forward. And with that, I'm gonna let somebody else talk.
Actually, I'm going to keep everybody on their toes, including my panelists. So I'm going to switch. We're not going to go down the order. I'm going to jump to Judge Marcus for your take on something we call people-centered justice and the change in continuity therein.
First of all, let me just thank the ABA and Rowley for having me here It's an honor and a pleasure, just a young judge from New Orleans coming to speak to such a powerful room. It really means a lot to me. Russell Hilton, a participant in the New Orleans reentry program, was posed the question recently, where would you be without this program? And his response was, I would probably be dead. So when we're talking about people-centered justice, you may see Russell as just one person, but I see Russell as a population of people that need service. People-centered justice is just that. People are at the center, but not just at the center, they are the primary concern. As a judge in New Orleans, I have the honor and the privilege of presiding over a reentry program. And that program is designed for individuals who are ultimately going to be released into society. As you know, the vast majority of people that are incarcerated, they come back. And the communities they come back to are ours. So what this program attempts to do is provide certain resources for them. There are two portions of the program. One is an in-jail portion, where a person, if he or she does not have a GED, they'll have that opportunity. And they also get 2 trades. And then they come home to the probation portion of this program, and that's where me and my team, we really get to work. And one of the first things that we do when an individual comes home is that individual goes through a substance abuse and mental health assessment. In addition to, we automatically schedule the first trauma therapy session. Go to jail, there's gonna be trauma. There's no doubt about it. So we literally wrap our arms around these people. We show them that we care about them. We show them that we love them. We show them that we can provide a better way and that they can provide a better way for their families ultimately. When I was approached about this concept or notion of people-centered justice, to be honest, it was the first time that I heard it. But as I started to talk about it, they told me, well, what you're doing is people-centered justice. And one of the things that I do is I set a docket day. In the midst of my felony trial calendar, there's one day out of the month where all I do is reentry. Because those individuals, they deserve that time and attention. I even step down from the bench. I take my robe off. I take my robe off for 2 reasons. One is my vanity. I think my shirt, tie, glasses combination looks good, and I want you to see it. The other is I don't want the participants to be intimidated. I don't want them to look up at me. I want us to be on the same level because we are human beings. And I think when you talk about people-centered justice and putting people first, the first thing you have to understand is these are humans. They breathe just like us. They bleed just like us. They live just like us. They're gonna be with us in our community. So I would rather have them have these resources and being productive members of society as opposed to those who are causing havoc and wreaking havoc on our society. So this program has been around for 10 years. I am the only judge in New Orleans that presides over such a program, although there are others in the state of Louisiana, but I don't know how they conduct it. I know I'm the only one that is gonna step down from the bench. I'm the only one that's gonna not wear that robe. I'm the only one that's gonna have a personal relationship with each participant. Some of y'all may think I'm crazy, but they have my cell phone number. And they call. And I answer. And together, we can work through the problems. Another concept, another aspect of people-centered justice is that these individuals, they have a role in their recovery. They have a role or responsibility in their lives. So it's not just what Judge DeLarge or his team tells them to do, they have input. And we take that input and we devise a plan. And now it's not the plan that I devised for them, it's the plan that they devised for themselves. So in all of this and all of my coaching and teaching and being a lawyer and being a judge, what I've learned is if you show an individual that you care about it, you show an individual that you can provide resources to them, they won't disappoint you.
Thank you, Judge. Why don't we move back down this way? Another perspective from Judge Lucy on what people-centered justice means to you, how you're understanding this concept.
I think it'll help to give you a little bit of, it'll help to give you a little bit of my background. So I'm a judge in Los Angeles County, a county with 4 million residents. It's the largest criminal system in the world. I'm a commissioner in the California Access to Justice Commission. I'm a member of the Judicial Council of California, which is the policymaking body of California. I also sit on the ABA. I'm a commissioner at the Youth at Risk Commission. I also volunteer my time at my local high school that I went to, Roosevelt High School, and it's in East LA. If anybody is familiar with East LA, you know could be a very rough neighborhood, but it's also a very special place. But childhood for me was hardly idyllic. When I was 8 years old, my mother was sentenced to life in prison, and she's still in prison today. And I always say that life in prison means for the rest of your life. And I see some young people in the audience, and I know there's young people watching online, and I say to you, when you make the wrong choices in your life, the consequences of those actions will follow you. Same thing with the right choices in your life. And so when I was 8 years old, I was sent to foster care, and foster care from when I was 8 until I aged out at 18. And my mom was sentenced to life in prison for dealing of large quantities of illegal drugs. I remember our home being raided regularly by police dressed in full SWAT gear, everyone being handcuffed inside the home, including me. I was just a child. I remember the door being rammed open and all the furniture being turned upside down. I also remember the caseworkers that were assigned to me when I was sent to foster homes. I remember that I could feel that they cared, but they were too overwhelmed with all the cases that they had. I remember the judge who sentenced me, well, I always say to sentence me to foster care because that's what it felt like. It felt like I was being sent away to foster care. He couldn't pronounce my last name. I know, Mr. Solomon, you had a hard time. I know it's a hard one. But he seemed even busier than the caseworkers. I remember wondering if he knew that I was in the courtroom and that I was 8 years old. And that's one of the reasons that as a judge today, I try to treat everyone with respect, with dignity, to feel like they got heard. I have many cases. It's very usual to have 100 case load that day. But I try to make sure that people were heard and seen. And even though maybe they don't like my ruling, but that they felt like they left feeling like they were heard. Before long, I was placed with first of many of my foster families. I don't have any stories where I had mean foster parents. I don't remember any horrible stories. I went to group homes. But nobody was especially nice either. I remember knowing very early on that I was money for them, that I was a source of income. As my 18th birthday started drawing closer, back then they just kicked you out on your 18th birthday. I remember kids around me getting pregnant, being incarcerated, and even killed. I knew very early on that these kids were setting themselves up for failure or no future at all. So it's with this perspective in mind that I like to share what people-centered justice is to me and what it means. We have to come and meet people where they are. To people, what I am feeling in the criminal justice system in California, they want to be held accountable. And sometimes they know that there's been harm. The people that were harmed need to be made whole. But we need to find out ask them what their needs are. How did they get here? What California Governor Newsom has recently implemented the CARE Act, and I did write it down because I always forget what it stands for. Community Assistance Recovery and Empowerment Act. And it's a non-criminal proceeding but somebody petitions for this person. This is for, there hasn't been a crime in place, but they feel that there is a conservatorship needed, and to see what services we can, housing, support services, mental health treatment, drug treatment programs. And in the criminal side of it, there is also the carrot and stick approach. Like, we will offer you those services, but if you don't do these, then you might, the stick being prison, hands over them. So I'm excited to talk more about that, but that's where my experience comes in of what people-centered is.
Yes, thank you. I mean, an experience both from a personal as well as a professional perspective. Blerta, let's shift gears a little bit with someone, in the international development realm. Your
you,
take
Andrew.
on people-centered justice.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks everyone for coming out today. So I'm originally from Albania, and I grew up in communist Albania. My family was persecuted by the regime, and that meant my grandfather and all his brothers were killed. Our family was sent into labor camps, and I grew up in the poorest neighborhood in the city. So early on, I learned that justice is available only to certain groups of people, and it means different things for different people. So with that in mind, I have pursued, obviously, for personal and professional choices, a career in international development, focusing on important things such as human rights and rule of law, among many. To me, what people-centered justice is the blueprint and the operating environment or the operating framework that allows the service of justice to be delivered in an equitable and inclusive manner to everyone. So when I first heard about PCJ, which is the new cool term, I turned around to a lot of colleagues who are attorneys and lawyers and rule of law professionals to say, well, what have we been doing all along if not this, right? And I think it's not new to answer your question, Andrew, but I think it is a renewed commitment to what people-centered justice means at this day and age in conversations about inclusivity and diversity, and to reach out people where they're at and to understand what justice means to them and the means for delivering that justice. I think the great thing about the USAID rule of law policy, having people-centered justice at its forefront and at its center, is the fact that we are focusing on data and understanding how data can be collected, analyzed, and refined to improve the justice system and to improve the application, the processes that are associated with it, as well as to change mindset and behaviors, right? A lot of institutions and the premise in which they were built may very well be the fact that we are serving individuals, but not necessarily. Sometimes we forget where we're going, and it's important to bring it back, and the data is an important point to demonstrate not only what is working and what's not working, but also why. And so the behavior change piece is when we understand the gaps in data, we can actually address them, and we can make sure that the needs of the people are actually being met, as many of my colleagues said.
Thanks, Blerta. I would just draw everybody's attention to rather authoritative descriptions and definitions of what is people-centered justice that can be found in the elements of it can be found in the Hague Declaration on Access to Justice, also the final report, Justice for All, of the Pathfinders Task Force on Justice. Those are rich resources that help our understanding of this term, what is new and what is, in terms of continuity, makes up people-centered justice. Blerta, I want to stay with you and ask, how is ABA shifting the paradigm and applying people-centered justice, in your rule of law assistance activity? What's it look like? But also, what are the challenges to the extent that this is new? What are the challenges you're seeing, and what are you learning as you shift the paradigm?
Thanks, Andrew. So I think, so I work in the Middle East and North Africa division, and therefore, like in many parts of the world, including the US, the issues that we're trying to tackle are very complex, very dynamic. We have shifting environments. We have countries like Jordan, which is a bit more stable, and Libya, which is still very much a war zone. So you have very different contexts. You have to adapt continuously. And so trying to find simple and easy, quick solutions is not always the way to go, while there is a place for that. But I think it's important to understand that when we talk about rule of law or access to justice or people-centered justice, we need to look at the entirety of the person and not only the touch points with the formal or informal justice system. So that looks like, for example, in Jordan, we had a pilot program that focused on women and girls empowerment and worked with community-based organizations and civil society organizations to provide legal assistance, which is what ABA really does for its expertise, but also to connect a lot of survivors with mental health and psychosocial support. As the judge was mentioning here, it's crucial, particularly as a human who is traumatized often in encountering, in coming at the legal system, you often are traumatized one way or another, so it's important to address that. And it's also access to cash assistance for basic needs for that survivor and their dependents. It's shelter at times, and not always government shelter, because sometimes you're not allowed to leave. And so it looks different things for different people. And I think one of the speakers earlier today mentioned that when you go to India, you have 3 different sets of individuals there to support you. You have the social worker, the legal professional. So there are ways to look at the issues in a more comprehensive manner. And it's important for all of these chains to work together well in order for a survivor or for someone who is accessing the legal system to have a good experience, to find justice, and also to not be re-traumatized. So in Tunisia, one of our prior programs meant that we are providing also alternatives to incarceration. So we are not necessarily channeling everyone through the legal system, but there are probation offices established and a model that can be piloted and scaled countrywide. In Libya, it means something completely different because we have what is called a failed state and competing government or no government at any given point. So you need community dialogues and training civil society actors to commemorate and to actually help the community shape the narrative for what conflict meant for them and how do they move forward in a peaceful manner. So we're looking at truth and reconciliation dialogues and conversations at the community level. So it's more of an informal justice system. Of course, the challenges are many. I think one that we can all agree upon is that laws are not always designed with the user in mind, or they are thought sometimes that punitive laws are going to make a difference. And while well-intended or willing to deter, sometimes, for example, somebody from beating their wife or their partner in gender-based violence cases, a very punitive law allows for the victim not to ever report that, or mandatory reporting requires that everyone should report a crime, and that often is a very complex issue because you are reporting against people you are very close to, and they will be punished, and you will be punished, and that relationship will be destroyed. And so it is not always the court system or the legal framework that addresses the issue. And it needs to be addressed differently for different people, and they need to be able to define what that is for themselves if we really want it to be people-centered and empowering for those individuals. I think one of my personal, I guess, desires about people-centered justice to see it move forward is we talk often about user-centered design, and I think this term is thrown around, but I don't think we really define what the user is or what the person, right? The people who are meeting. And in a lot of societies, as demonstrated in one of the greatest books ever written about user-centered design, in my opinion, Invisible Women, it's societies, systems, legal frameworks are organized with a particular user in mind, and that's often male. of a certain demographic, and it looks different in very different countries. And so when you have a woman in Egypt that is going to divorce her husband because she's exhibiting or she has experienced gender-based violence, she has to file several cases, one for divorce, one for child custody, one for property rights, one for alimony, and many, many other things. So you're looking at a system that is, of course, impeding access to justice. It's making it incredibly difficult. And this is just the case for women. And then you add layers of marginalized communities, you add layers of ethnic conflict, even just basic accessibility, as someone mentioned earlier, for deaf and hard of hearing, or mobile physical accessibility that you live in such a remote location. So I think it's important to define what the user is and how we support that user to access and make and facilitate their access to justice. What we are learning is that, for example, we need to democratize, I think it's the word often used, for mental health services, where you don't always have to have a PhD to provide counseling. And I think that applies in also the legal services, where you can have paralegals, you can have people that are trained to do certain functions that are usually conducted by lawyers. You can have CSOs that can conduct a lot of these services, or they can make referrals to the right people. So you don't always necessarily need a lawyer, and I'm sorry for the lawyers here, but there are also other connection. We need to find the connective tissue of how the legal service is tied up to everything else, so that we are providing support to the individual as a whole and not just their legal needs. Did I answer all your points?
Brilliantly. Let's bring our judges back into the discussion. And while people-centered justice, it does seek to provide multiple pathways and multiple means to justice and for preventing legal problems, but ultimately addressing them, people do end up in court. And the role of courts and judges is critical to the justice system, obviously, and people-centered justice. So just beginning with Judge Lucy, how is your court, or you personally in the court, applying this people-centered approach that you spoke about, and conduct proceedings that, perhaps more effectively solve people's legal needs? Like, I'm a lawyer, I don't want to go to court. Sometimes I don't understand what's going on in the courtroom, I admit. How can you make that experience
I think
more user-friendly?
first and foremost is recognizing that we need to hold people accountable, right? There's an action that took place. Maybe there was a harm, maybe there's a victim that was harmed that needs to be made whole again. There's an obligation to repair those harms, but we also have an obligation to create safe and healthy communities and start addressing the root causes of why something happened. What was the root cause of why the harm occurred? A people-centered justice puts a focus on what the needs of the parties are. There has to be an absolute need to put an emphasis on collaboration, not only with two parties, but also collaborating with the services and organizations that are in the community. We are so accustomed, or this foundation is an adversarial system, right? Two people, and then the judge decides. We have to start looking at using resources and collaborating with the community. For example, I mentioned before, California Governor Newsom did the Community Assistance Recovery and Empowerment Act. This one is a voluntary agreement with the person. Usually it's somebody who has schizophrenia or other mental health illnesses. They do a care agreement or a court-ordered plan. The plan will include treatment, housing, support, and any other services for the schizophrenia, for the mental health, substance abuse. Once the court has ordered that court-ordered plan, the court will hold regular status conferences, hearings. We do a progress report on how it's working. It's a relatively new program. There's a pilot, so to speak. There's 11 counties, LA being one of them. But even in this, the latest budget was revealed, and we are in a deficit. The governor did put this as a priority, and will be fully funded. But that doesn't necessarily apply to criminal proceedings. This is a civil proceeding, voluntary. The person or if the petitioner, hopefully it'll be a caretaker that petitions for these services. For criminal, we have the collaborative courts programs, and that's for people that are facing felony charges, people who have special needs, such as veterans, people with co-occurring disorders, substance abuse with mental health, youth, some women, anyone else who has been identified as needing not only services, but also they need specialized supervision. These people go to what we call the collaborative courts. And they are people who are homeless or need special services. We link up with those community organizations that have contracts with the county to deliver these specialized needs in the community. Services are tailored to meet the very needs of these individuals who have been harmed or who have done the harm. The stick is that you can ultimately end up in prison for the felony that you are alleged to have been committed, but also you hope that you go with the carrot and get that therapy and those medications that will hopefully solve some of the concerns. In LA County, we have also tried to go to people in the community instead of having them come to downtown LA, where it can be hard to park. If you're familiar with LA, traffic anywhere takes about 2 hours to get anywhere. Driving to downtown LA, having people get there by 8:30, that will automatically order, or I don't even have discretion, I have to issue their bench warrant for the arrest. And so allowing us to go into the community, leave the courtroom, to meet people where they are. People who are homeless or are at risk of becoming homeless, we also go into homeless shelters or community events if they're not necessarily at a shelter, but where we know there's a community of people gathering. We go periodically into the community to clear up, this is not necessarily for felonies, or it's more like to clear up any bench warrants that are outstanding for misdemeanors, any traffic citations. The court will hold special sessions inside the community to resolve any of these warrants. It's people-centered that we're really trying to look at the individual who has done the harm, but also the person who was harmed. We need to be better about, don't just decide what is good for them, but also ask them what they feel their needs are. What would be a fair outcome for them, as Justice Marcus was saying. We find that most of them do want to be held accountable. They make the person that they harm, they want to help them be whole again. As I said earlier, I sit on the ABA Commission at Youth at Risk, and we recently passed a resolution that would, among other things, make sure that we engage people with lived experiences, such as myself, to figure out what we could have done differently. We need to have people with lived experiences making decisions. We can have a system that is built not just on equity, but also empower people to advocate for their own needs. We see the LGBTQ communities advocate for marriage equality. We see undocumented communities fight for DACA, but it's rare when we see people who have experienced prison and or foster care to truly advocate for the reforms that are truly needed. And sometimes we see well-intentioned advocates invite these former foster kids to the table, but it's usually simply to be a spokesperson for sad stories. These well-intentioned advocates have already developed an agenda and they've crafted the policy idea that they want. But we need to empower the people impacted by these systems to advocate for bold ideas. Don't just give them a pre-written script in support of some incremental change and use us to pull at the heartstrings of the decision makers. This is not people-centered. I am glad we're engaging people who have lived experiences, but to be more people-centered, we need these individuals to have actual influence and ownership of the solutions being crafted.
Thank you. Judge Marcus, you earlier gave us a small example, a taste of how you and your court are addressing the needs, the experiences, and trying to make the process not only more fair, but understandable and equitable. Could you elaborate more on how your court is really trying to develop these people-centered practices, approaches? And to what extent does it require a mindset shift, amongst, everyone in the court?
So I think I'll answer the latter part first, because it may be the easier part for me. Obviously, I was elected at 37 to serve in this capacity, and obviously my colleagues are not 37, right? So there's a generational gap there that exists where I want to service people, and they just, no offense, but they kind of want to do their job and go home, right? And I don't mind putting forth the effort. So in addition to the reentry court, my court, I have a mental health and a drug court, but the court also has domestic violence court. We have homeless court. We have other sections of court. They have those drug courts, and they tried their best to have those on certain days again. And I think that's really important, that these days for drug court, or mental health court, or reentry court, or homeless court, they're set in stone. These judges are not concerned with what's on their docket that day. So they can give these individuals, again, their undivided attention. I don't know if you guys understand, when an individual goes to jail, it's not just him or her that goes to jail. It's that family, right? And it's not just that family, it's that community, it's that city, it's us in this room, because to some degree, our taxes are paying for that individual to be incarcerated. And I just know from data that it costs less to invest in some of these programs than it does to put someone in jail. So these families are being better. People ask me all the time, they say, well, Judge, you don't have that many people in your program, do you think it's making a difference? And I told you about Russell Hilton. And if I can make a difference in one life, that one life affects a family, that family affects a community, that community affects a city, that city affects a state, that state affects a nation, that nation affects the world. So it starts with one. And I just want you guys to understand that what we do try to do in our court is we try to implement best practices. And best practices are driven by numbers. There's a well-known musician that said, men lie and women lie, but numbers don't lie. So those numbers are where we decide how we're going to implement certain things. It's the numbers that tell us. It's the numbers that drive us to know what needs to be done. I never went to jail. I didn't know that it was going to be a traumatic experience, but the numbers tell me that that's going to be trauma in there. So I know they need it when they come home. And I'm happy that I'm doing it in my court, but obviously I have a bigger task ahead of me, and that's to make sure that everybody in my court in New Orleans is doing it. And then being in front of people like you, decision makers, the powerful people that you are, you can sell this program to your jurisdictions. In New Orleans, one thing that we are doing with this reentry program, we have a lot of juvenile crime in New Orleans. And one thing that we are turning this reentry program into a pilot program that's called No Entry. And if you can imagine what it is, it's exactly what it is. We are trying to catch troubled youth before they enter the criminal justice system. And I think if we can do that, and we can have a better tomorrow, New Orleans can have a better tomorrow. The stats show that I come from a state that is, per capita, we incarcerate more people than any other state in this nation. In the 90s, New Orleans was known as the murder capital of the world. And sadly, we tout that title today. So I know that incarcerating people alone doesn't work. So we have to have other approaches. We have to have people-centered, people-oriented approaches, because if not, we're going to continue to be the murder capital of the world. We'll continue to incarcerate more folks than anybody else in the country, and that's not what I want to come to you and tell you in front of these panels. I want to tell you that we're reducing it, and I want to tell you about the great programs that we have because they exist. Unfortunately, right now in our legislature, we had some criminal justice reform that took place in 2017. And because of the uptick in violent crimes in the state, they are trying to repeal a lot of that. And I think it's going to be detrimental. It's going to be costly. And quite frankly, it's going to decimate the communities, especially the ones that I came from, because most of the individuals that are incarcerated, they are Black men. And if I tell the people that come before me, I ask them if they have a son or a daughter, and there's only one way a Black boy will become a successful Black man, is as if he sees one. If that individual is not in the house, then that person is going to have a tough road into being successful. So we try to use all of these data points, all of these practices, and try to help as best we can. And I'm proud to say that my court is doing some things, but obviously we can do more. There's always more to do. Until we live in a utopian society, then there's always work to do.
Thanks, Judge. Malia, from your work in legal aid, legal services, working with indigenous populations, are you seeing any innovation in making the system more accessible, more equitable, more navigable?
Yes, and I want to talk about specifically efforts to focus on client priorities, client desires and needs, as well as improved communications. But before I do that, I want to say that structurally, one of the major impediments to making progress in this area is often the law itself. So we define law as a case. It is a criminal case. You get a public defender for your criminal case. What does that mean for a client who says to their public defender, they're really most concerned about the impact on their housing and child custody? How often does their public defender have to look at them and say, not my job, not relevant, right? And so to get to a client-centered view, we have to break down some of those structural impediments to actually having client-centered representation. That said, there is a lot of progress, right? And so let's just talk a little bit about client feedback. 10 years ago, the idea of a client survey in public defense was like, nobody wanted to talk about it. There's still a lot of resistance because there's a lot of concern that criminal cases often don't result in good outcomes for our clients. And so is that client feedback going to be negative? As lawyers, we're scared, right? We're overachievers and criticism is scary. But they are in far more use than 10 years ago. And that process continues to improve. So let me say, client feedback at the end of a case, at the end of a representation, has no possibility of helping that client get better representation. I mean, unless you're going to assume recidivism for everyone, which let's try not to. And so I think one of the efforts that's now happening is an effort to make it kind of an interactive process. So for example, courts put in place a lot of text reminder systems, trying to cut down on failures to appear in the resulting bench warrants. You now get a text telling you when your hearing is. When public defenders kind of took over and started to do those text reminders, it was to make it more interactive and allow the client to say, oh no, I have a childcare issue or I have a transportation issue, can you move the hearing? Well, now you're having a dialogue. Now public defender offices are trying to use that or think about using that as a way to get interim feedback. So, I'll give you a really good example. If when you had a hearing, afterwards you got a 5-question survey, did your lawyer talk to you before the hearing? Let me stop right there because I did that intentionally. That's a terrible question. Did your lawyer talk to you before the hearing? Right, so let's talk about this on a micro level. How about, did your lawyer help you prepare for the hearing? Client-centered little, client-centered big. And then, do you understand what happened at the hearing? Do you understand what happens next? Do you need something from your public defender? And if the question is yes, oh good, now what's the public defender office going to do, right? And that is kind of the next big innovation that I'm kind of really excited about, which is increasingly public defender offices are hiring their former clients to be client navigators. And it's really important because, and it's not just us, but we are terrible at constantly trying to explain things we do every day, like the bail process, to our clients who may be going through it for the first time. Explaining something you do every day as if you've never done it or heard it before is actually tremendously difficult. I watched cooking shows and watching like challenges where chefs have to write recipes for home cooks. They're terrible at it. They leave out the part about putting in oil in the pan, right? That's us. We do that too. And so former clients as client navigators, people who have experience but are much closer to the idea of the fear attendant to that experience, of the nature of going into that with their freedom at stake, very important. I would say that that's part and parcel of a growing movement called participatory defense, in which you also engage client communities. You investigate by using your clients and their networks to try and help. Originally designed to kind of bridge, honestly, like lack of resources for investigative services in defense, but really kind of capitalizing on helping clients not just become the purpose of the representation, but a part of the team, right? We talk about team defense all the time. Your client should be on your team, not just like the goal or the result, right? A team member. And so it is simple steps. Every single person here has talked about meeting clients where they are, right? And that's not just about trying to speak to them in language that they will understand, making sure that you are not talking down, but talking, appropriately and explanatory, not skipping steps because you know them so well, but also literally going to the community and meeting, right? And sometimes it's as simple as like public defender offices are thinking about where to put their offices. Traditionally, they've been right next to the court. But whose convenience is that for? Right? So thinking about it on these kind of very big ways and very small ways of getting to more people-centered representation.
Super. So they want us to talk about data.
Good.
And data is important with people, for people-centered justice and putting people at the center of the justice system. So again, we're going to do lightning round here because we also want to leave some time for our audience to engage. So just, very quickly, other than some of the standard data like case clearance rates, time to disposition, number of criminal convictions, things that we capture through case management information systems, which we spend lots of money on in countries and jurisdictions around the world. What types of data do you believe the justice institutions and actors, including civil society, should be collecting to make the system more effective in meeting the needs of the population? And where are the gaps? Any specific tools that you can point to get better data? Let's go down. We can go all the way down. Just remember, lightning round.
Thank you, Andrew. I think as the rule of law policy that USAID has put out, I think data-driven and evidence-based decision-making is crucial to people-centered design. And in my experience in international development for the last 20 years, I think it's important to collect data not only on demographics of the users or the people that we are meaning to serve, but also their touch points, either with the formal or the informal justice system. And which services do they access for what? It's important to understand their definition of justice and the means for delivering it. And it's also important to collect data on other actors that may not be state or government actors that factor into delivering justice, which is sometimes the media and actual reporting. It can be CSOs, community-based organizations, faith-based organization, et cetera. It looks different in every single context. I think this is important also when it comes to designing better solutions, because then you have trauma-informed lawyering, trauma-informed service delivery that is intended to, of course, meet people where they're at and to also collect better depositions, often for legal cases, in order to accommodate and to understand what a trauma survivor has gone through in a particular case and how that impacts their actual documentation and witnessing. I think it's important to also address, I think you mentioned a little bit, the fact of how expensive it is to collect data. And I think I would put financing as the core challenge of collecting data, particularly in a lot of international development programs. Some of our donors, and I will not mention which, put out solicitations without necessarily collecting data for the demographics we are intending to serve. And at times, we are looking for solutions by talking only to state or government actors, when in fact we should be talking to the people that we are designing that program or solicitation for, and actually responding to those needs. And it's really difficult for an implementing partner or anyone to actually get to the gist of that in 30 to 60 days. But I think these needs to be done periodically so that we have a better understanding of what's going on in any given context and designing programming that's responsive to it. The other piece, I think, I would say that once we have that data, we have to provide the skill sets, the training, and also the capacities and PII, the personally identifiable laws that we have to follow to ensure that we are not violating people's privacy rights and to ensure that we are actually building the capacity across different institutions, different countries, and different actors to use that data to make decisions. Because it is expensive to do all of this process, but it's also, I think, the intangible result, if we don't actually use it, is far greater. The impact is far greater if we don't make use of it. I think I would stop there for me.
Yeah, and thanks for those not so subtle messages and recommendations.
The
to
Balkans are not a people of subtleties. I hope you know that.
Judge Marcus.
And I think I'll be brief. There's just a couple of areas where I would like to see data. There's a saying that hurt people, if that makes any sense. So I would like, I'm sure we can find this out. I want to know how many people that inflict either a violent crime or some pain upon someone else had that same type of pain or crime inflicted upon them. The two other questions that I always have and I always ask, I don't ever get the response I think I'm looking for is, do you feel you were really represented? Not that you had a lawyer standing next to you, because that's different than the question that I'm asking. Do you feel that you were truly represented? And I think if we can get that answer, then that could get to our public defender's office, and then they could be more people-centered there. And then obviously, as a judge, I'm an elected official. I'm responsible to these people in this community. So I want to know if the work that I did was satisfactory. And if it wasn't, I'm okay with that. Tell me how I can get better. I'm not above the law. I'm not above pushing myself to be a better judge. So I always ask those questions. They never tell, they always say, Judge, you did great. And I know that's not the answer, but it's not helping me improve. It's not helping me be more people-centered. So those three areas, I would personally want that information.
I would say that, like you were saying, the actual statistics is very important. It's such a big factor. We need high-quality research and information. We need data that is nonpartisan and objective. We need data that is both responsive to immediate and long-term needs. That all goes without saying. But to get true and accurate data, there needs to be a foundation of trust. There is so much well-placed mistrust that it's not easy to collect that data, to get true data. Until we repair and rebuild that trust, we're never going to really know if it's true and accurate factual data.
So I'm very focused on specific aspects of data collection, and I'd build a little on what you said. I think that if every public defender office isn't having a standardized client interview form in which they're collecting data, we have a real problem, because for the most part, our demographic data on clients in our system often comes from cops, and it's observational data. It's really terrible data, right? So focusing not just on data collection, but on quality data collection and asking the question, is the person who's producing the data you're getting the data from the best source of the data? And not duplicating data. So, work a lot with public defender offices on creating, bridges between court data systems and public defense data systems so that two different groups are not collecting dispositional data systems that then have, dispositional data or initial charge data. And we can streamline this process because data collection is onerous and costly. And so data systems that talk to each other would be great. But I think one of the things I want to say on this point is that we have to also look at ourselves. So the ABA actually adopted a policy on data collection demographic data collection on judges and lawyers, all publicly paid lawyers. That would include prosecutors, attorney general offices, public defenders, right? And we know we have a representation issue that is a barrier to people-centeredness. And I think very wisely, the ABA chose to start with itself, start with the lawyers and the judges before you push to saying we need to collect data from clients. And so I would say, we need data. We really do. And that one more thing, which is to go to Betsy's point, which is that data collection, that reliance on data and numerics is not the antithesis of people-centered, it's the way that you get there. And I think that kind of seeing it as antithetical or even in conflict, we really have to do the work to put an end to that. That's really, really important.
Thanks, everyone. I believe ABA undertook or designed this program to really surface and learn from the practice and the innovation in the U.S. legal system within the ABA and the legal profession and justice system writ large. And I think we did that. You did that. And there's certainly a lot of good practice that we can learn from. So we have a little bit of time. 4 minutes?
You can go a little longer.
I do hope that we have, either some comments or some questions from participants. We can take them and group them together for our audience response. So please, if you do, raise your hand. Okay, Sam, please.
Thank you.
Sam Mueller,
Yeah.
just introduce yourself.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm Sam Muller. I am the executive director of HIL, the Hague Institute for the Innovation of Law. And it's fascinating to hear this. And I wonder if I could ask you a more systemic question. Because one of the things that we see a lot in people-centered justice is call it the graveyard of pilots. That there's a lot of small things happening, but somehow the system isn't able to help, support. And I've talked to so many judges who say, my best moments as a judge was when I basically told the system to bugger off, and I did what I had to do to make it better. So I just wonder if you could say a few things, any one of you, on the system support that is needed to make these things happen. Are you getting that? Do you have any thoughts on how we can strengthen that?
Well, I can tell you for the reentry program and these other, what I call specialty courts, I think y'all call it that in California too. What it boils down to is resources, right? So there are a whole bunch of grants that we have to apply for. But the more resources that I have at my disposal, then that's the more resources that each participant has at his disposal. I can give you an example, right? Like an individual comes home from prison, I can find him a job. That's different than a career, right? So I'm trying to phase in that portion of our program, but that takes resources. I have an individual that wants to go get a CDL, he can't pay for it. I need to be able to pay for him to get that CDL. When he gets that CDL, he's either going to work for someone or he's going to start his own business. If he wants to start his own business, it would be great if I had the resources to help him get the LLC first, and then help him maybe purchase or give him the down payment for that first truck. All right, now I'm putting someone in a position who, they don't just have a job, you know, New Orleans is a big service industry place on Bourbon Street and all of the restaurants. And you may be able to support your family to that, but that's just a job in my mind. I want you to have a career, and those are two separate things, but to make that career happen, I need the resources so then I can give it to those participants. So I think it boils down to resources for me and my program.
I would agree, but it also takes a lot of courage. I think the previous panel was talking about judicial independence, judicial impartiality, but we're still humans, right? And so when we are doing some courageous moves and saying, forget the system, I'm gonna do the right thing here, you have thick skin and you are trained to don't worry about the noise, but you still get affected by the noise. And in California, we're appointed by the governor, but you're up for election every 6 years. And there is that sense of, if I do this courageous thing, I mean, I will always do the courageous thing, but you do wonder, is it gonna bring a challenge and am I gonna get thrown out? So there is that sense of, you have to have the courage to do the right thing. But the very foundation of independence and impartiality is always, you know, swimming around the, you know, I think that's why we see less courageous judges out there too.
Yeah, for me, I think we have to have pathways out of this system, the justice system, right? The justice system has slowly started to encompass everything else. It now encompasses mental health. It encompasses a lot of substance abuse, which is health. We've tried to make it all things. And as much as I appreciate a judge who wants to be able to have access to small business loans or what I want pathways out of this system as much as I want anything else, and an opportunity to say, this doesn't belong here, without that having to mean you're buggering the system to do it, right? We need to create more pathways for that. We've had 30 years of massive expansion of the justice system, possibly longer, and I think it would be people-centered to try and reverse that.
Other questions, comments, insights? Yes, please. We'll take two, and then I think we'll call it. So just introduce yourself from.
Ken Kelmer, Department of Justice, but you're my personal capacity. What would you advise legal practitioners or lawyers what they could do in legal practice to improve accessibility and outcomes as you're describing?
How to improve accessibility and outcomes. Okay, and one last question, and we'll sneak another one in.
Sure. Luis Olafia with the American Bar Association. So, especially for New Orleans, but also I guess also LA because of the amount of people. How, in the end, it goes back to the judge is one person, and then the system it's a monster, and then how have you navigated? And I'm asking this because it would be good to learn how to navigate this with other countries where we are facing similar problems like impunity. The only way the criminal system works is to incarcerate people. Next, how have you navigated those conversations where you have to convince elected people and colleagues about the need to collect data when the data comes to you is not good and there's no time to collect data? It costs money and forces to add something else into whatever you're doing and pause and reflect, which you never have time. And this is like comparable to many things that we're seeing in other countries. Let's be honest, we're not that different in certain states in the US to jurisdictions in other countries. How do you convince people that you need to spend money here if you want a system that doesn't only works to incarcerate people, but you need to invest money and take something else on top of you, how have you, this is more like human, how have you navigated those conversations? Have they led somewhere?